We are in the third week of a series entitled By Faith that comes directly from the book of Hebrews, from the letter of Hebrews chapter 11 specifically. And Hebrews chapter 11 gives us one of, I think, our most well-known definitions of faith, one that we often will go to as a church when we're trying to understand what faith really is. And this is what the Hebrew authors tells us. They say that now faith is confidence. So what is faith? Faith is confidence in what we hope for, and assurance about what we do not see. In the first week of this message series, we broke down those two words, the first the word for confidence, and then second the word for assurance, to try to understand what faith really is. What is the kind of faith, what kind of faith at least that the Hebrew author is trying to describe to us. And so first, remember the word hypostasis. Hypo is kind of this word for over or beyond, above, and stasis, we know what stasis is, right? Stasis is something that is firm, that is immovable. It's not movement. There's no movement to it. So it is immovable. So first, faith is confidence, this immovable confidence in what we hope for. And then second, the word elegchos, which does indicate some sort of movement. As I talked about that first week, almost indicates this idea. It brings you to this picture, this place where you see somebody reaching for something that is invisible, that they know is there, but they can't quite see it with their eyes, but they believe when they reach out to it, it's going to be there. It's going to be solid and firm. And so that word actually indicates some type of movement, that we're doing something. There's action to what it is. So it is also assurance, the kind of assurance that says, I'm going to do something about it, about what we do not see. So faith is being able to know that where we stand is solid, but also knowing and trusting that if we step out when God calls us to step out, we're going to be stepping out onto more solid ground, even if we don't see it. That is what faith is. That is the kind of faith that the Hebrew author is talking about. And so what we concluded from that is that faith, at least this kind of faith, the faith that we're talking about here, faith produces faithfulness. Faith calls us to faithfulness. Faith, if we say, I have faith in God, I believe in God, then that kind of faith elicits a response. It elicits movement. And as we looked at the story of Noah last week, here's where we landed. Faith moves us. Again, faith is about movement. Faith moves us to step out and do what would make absolutely no sense. Remember, God came to Noah 120 years before a flood. It hadn't rained before. And he said, listen, I want you to build this box. It's going to be gigantic, 450 feet long. It's going to be 4 stories high, 75 feet wide. It's going to be huge. And I want you to build this box. And it's going to take you quite a bit of time. Maybe 75 years it took Noah to build this ark. And I'm sure everybody around him looked at him and thought, what are you doing? This makes no sense whatsoever. Except for God. And the kind of faith that we're being called to, in fact, that's exactly why the Hebrew authors write this chapter. They want us to know. They want us to know about the examples of those who've gone before us so that it inspires us to do similar things. Maybe not build an ark, but there are times when you and I are called to step out on faith, step out and by faith do something that makes no sense to those around us. Sometimes, even beyond that, we're called to step out and by faith to do something that makes no sense to us, except God has called us to do it. And so our answer beyond all reason is, yes, God, by faith I will. Now, verse 2 goes on to tell us, verse 2 of chapter 11 goes on to tell us that exactly this kind of behavior, living this way, was what the ancients were commended for. It's what the ancients were commended for. It's what we celebrate when we look at their lives. When we read their stories, we see their example and we say, man, I wish I could live like that. And the truth is, by faith, you can. As we set the stage for this morning's message, I want to share with you something that I think many of you will be able to relate to. Uh, there are times where I come home from what can be a difficult day at the office, or maybe something happens in the life of a member here at the church. It just breaks my heart, and I'm burdened along with you when that happens. I have difficult days, and I assume you do as well. Maybe days where the stress of the work is burdening you down to some degree, and so when you get home, what do you do when that is what has been your day has looked like? Well, for me, there's a place in the house that I love to go. It's my recliner. I bought this recliner about almost 2 years ago, and I love my recliner. I also like the TV that sits in front of my recliner by about 15 feet, and that is a good way of kind of numbing my mind to reality every now and then by turning on the news and seeing somebody else's problems. But I love that spot in my recliner, and that recliner has seen me through many football games and baseball games and soccer matches and even tennis every now and then. And I like that recliner because after about 2 years, that recliner it's become sort of accustomed to my body. The reality is, if you went and sat in my recliner and we didn't share the same dimensions as far as our body frame is concerned, you might sit in my recliner and think, it's kind of lumpy in some spots that I don't like my support there, but for me, it's great. I mean, it's perfect. Every time I climb into that chair, it fits like a glove. It's comfortable. It's familiar. And it's amazing how that comfort and that familiarity can draw me in at times, especially at the end of a hard day. Maybe some of you morning folks will be able to relate to this. By about 9 or 9:30, many of you who love the morning, there's another place of familiarity and comfort that is calling your name, right? And it's your bed. And my wife, she is a morning person. And I'm not really. But by the time we get to about 8 o'clock, if we have not really made the transition of getting our kids to bed, that's when she starts to lose her mind. Because she knows that every minute past 8 o'clock we go is a minute past 9 or 9:30 we're going to go when it comes time for her to want to be in the bed and not walking on her 2 feet anymore. And I'm kind of the opposite of that. I could stay up for a while longer still. And so maybe some of you who are not morning people, who are night owls like I can be, I have the tendency to be at times. Maybe some of you can identify with me, and it's the bed too. You like the bed, and you like the comforter pulled all the way up to your chin as well. And when your alarm clock goes off, and you have to get up at the same time as the morning people do, that's the moment you know what it feels like to be robbed of your comfort in that familiar spot. Well, those are just a couple of illustrations to point out that there's this reality. We really do like what is comfortable and what is familiar, don't we? I mean, we like those places. We go to those places. We're like water often. You know what they say about water? Water finds the path of least resistance. That's how water travels. That's why water doesn't travel uphill. Water travels downhill. And that's why water tends to not want to go over a rock. It goes around the rock because it's the easiest path. And often as human beings, we're very similar. We like the downhill slope, but not the uphill slope as much. We like going around obstacles instead of having to work over or around or through an obstacle. That's the truth about us. We like our comfort and we like our familiarity. Well, I want you to keep that in mind as we read together what Hebrews 11 says about Abraham. Now remember again, the ancients were commended for the kind of lives that they lived by faith. So as we read about what Hebrews 11 says about Abraham, keep that in mind. Keep in mind as well that we as human beings tend to like what is comfortable and familiar. So here we go. From Hebrews 11:8, if you got your Bibles, we'll spend most of our time in Hebrews 11 with a quick jump into Genesis chapter 12 as well to kind of get a little bit more depth on what happened with Abraham. So Hebrews 11:8. By faith, Abraham, when called to go to a place he would later receive as inheritance, obeyed and went. Listen to these last words. Even though he did not know where he was going. So by faith, when Abraham was called, so God called Abraham to do something by faith. God shows up on Abraham's doorstep and he says, Abraham, I've got a mission for you. I've got something I want you to say yes to by faith. Here's what I want you to do. I want you to go to a place you'll later receive as your inheritance. I want you to be faithful. I want you to obey. Just as we talked about that last week, faith produces obedience. We don't always love that word obedience in this country. We don't like the concept of authority sometimes as well. But the reality is faith produces obedience in God. And so Abraham obeyed even though he didn't know where he was going. Genesis 12 says it this way. The Lord had said to Abraham, go from your country, your people, and your father's household to the land I will show you. So Abraham was asked to leave his father, or his household, his family. Abraham, I want you to leave your family. Okay? Abraham, I want you to leave the culture that you're familiar with. I want you to leave your people. Okay? And actually, I want you to go to another country entirely. And you go on faith, and as you go, I will show, God says. I'm not going to tell you beforehand. As you go, I will show. Just as the Hebrew author says, he didn't know where he's going. He just followed God. And so Abraham obeyed. Verse 4 says it this way. So Abraham went as the Lord had told him, and Lot his nephew, inspired by Abraham's example of faith, followed along with him. Now, check this out. As if it wasn't enough to leave your family, your people, your kind of familiar space with those that you're culturally familiar with, and your country, Abraham, on top of all of that, was 75 when God shows up and asks him to do this. So when God shows up to Abraham and says, Abraham, I want you to launch out on a new adventure. Some of you are adventurous, and you'd say, yeah, new adventure, I'm for that. Others of you don't like adventure at all. The concept of adventure makes you anxious just as you think about it. Here was Abraham at 75. I imagine if you lived in one place for 75 years, the thought of pulling up your roots and relocating and moving somewhere else would be very difficult. It might bring about some serious stress, some serious anxiety, especially when you considered what you were leaving behind to say yes to it. Everything he had invested 75 years of his life in, Abraham by faith left behind so that he could follow God. So back into Hebrews 11, this is what the Hebrew author tells us about this, that by faith he made his home in the promised land like a stranger in a foreign country. Okay, you might look at that and say that makes sense. I can understand how when he pulled up roots and went from where he was, a place he lived for 75 years with his family, with those people that were like him in his culture, in his country, and he pulled up roots and he went somewhere else, that he would probably be kind of like a stranger. I mean, when you leave, have you ever been out of the country and gone to a place where people were very different from you, a very different culture? You get off the airplane and it doesn't take you long to figure out you're a stranger. You're different. This doesn't feel quite the same. Maybe you don't speak the same language. Maybe you wear very different clothes. We have teams from this church that have gone to India on multiple occasions. And sometimes they will come into this church building on a Sunday morning, sometimes on a Sunday where we're celebrating the missions that God has called us into and where we've been able to, by faith, say yes to these missions. They will show up on a Sunday morning wearing some of the clothes that people in India wear. And they're a little bit different from the clothes that we wear here. But if you show up wearing the clothes that you have and nobody else is wearing clothes like you, and you show up speaking English and nobody's speaking English, you're going to feel strange in a foreign country. You're going to look like a stranger in a foreign country. And so you might say, just that alone is enough to make me understand why Abraham would have felt like a stranger in a foreign country, but there's more. Here's what it is. Abraham never built for himself a permanent home in this foreign country. This is what we see. He lived in tents, and it wasn't just Abraham. The next 2 generations do the same. Isaac and Jacob also. So Isaac, Abraham's son, also lives in tents. Jacob also lives in tents. They didn't have a permanent place to live. They continued to be foreigners and strangers because they believed by faith that God had called them into that, and because of that, they were heirs of the same promise along with Abraham. Now, at this point in time, you might say, okay, I get it. If you had a really big faith in God, maybe you would just say yes to whatever it was that God asked you to do without knowing why, without seeing clearly what you're actually saying yes. Maybe you just go for that. But you see that at the end of that verse, there is this talk of promise. So what kind of promise had God made to Abraham where he said, listen, if you will do this, here's what I will do for you? Well, the way Hebrews sums it up is just simply this. He was looking forward to the city with foundations whose architect and builder is God. And then the next verse, verse 13, or just a couple verses down, this is a descriptor of all these people. All these people we're talking about, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, and all of their family, all of their relatives that were there with them doing the same thing, living by faith in tents, never having a permanent place to live, having left behind everything they knew and were familiar with. All these people were still living by faith when they died. They did not receive the things that were promised. They only saw them and welcomed them from a distance, admitting they were foreigners and strangers on earth. People who say such things show they are looking for a country of their own. If they had been thinking of the country they had left, they would have had opportunity to return. Instead, they were longing for a better country, a heavenly one. Therefore, God is not ashamed to be called their God, for he's prepared a city for them. You see that word better in there? That's significant. We'll come back to that in a few minutes. Let's just try to summarize some of the things that stick out about Abraham. Again, when Abraham was called to go, he was how old? 75. I think we can acknowledge as well that Abraham had built a life for himself and his family. So Abraham was called when he was 75. He was asked to leave behind everything he had built in 75 years and go and follow God. And he was willing to leave it all behind. Now, I think what we see very clearly about Abraham, at least, and we'll just kind of try to summarize this story, is that Abraham was willing or wasn't willing to settle for what was comfortable and familiar because he believed that God had something much better for him. I think we can see plainly that that is what Abraham believed. God had something much better. If you're going to come to me and you're going to ask me to uproot everything I've worked for in the last 75 years and you make me a promise, I believe that what you're promising me, God, is much better than all that you're asking me to leave behind by faith. And if the wheels are turning for you, like they've been turning for me as I've been preparing these messages in the series, you maybe are starting to feel a little bit of discomfort right here, a little bit of anxiety, a little bit of tension in this moment because you know, as I said at the beginning of this message, that Hebrews 11 was written for us to give us examples of what it looks like to live by faith so that we would do similar things by faith. we're not just telling these stories because they're neat stories and they're fun to tell and they make us feel good, and because, well, if you're my age, 40, almost 41, they looked really cool on a flannel graph. I mean, that is not why we're telling these stories, because they make interesting Veggie Tales. Right? That's not why we're telling these stories. That's not why Hebrews 11 shares this with us. It's so that by faith, we will see the examples of those who live by faith and say yes to doing similar things. And so in this moment, if you're feeling some tension, it probably revolves around a statement like this: but I like comfort. Or maybe one like this: but I like familiar. I like what's comfortable and I like what's familiar. In other words, I don't like what's uncomfortable and I don't like the unknown. I don't like those things. And so what I see, at least very plainly for me, and maybe you're like me in this, I see in this, here's a truth for me at least, that my love of things that are comfortable and familiar sometimes acts as a barrier to living by faith. I see that for me. Maybe that's not true for you. Maybe you're not feeling the same tension I am, but I imagine some of you at least are. Feeling the same kind of tension and the knowledge that I like comfort so much that if God came, well, for example, if God came to me and said, listen, I want you to leave your native culture. I want you to leave this culture that you're familiar with, people who speak the same language to you, and I want you to relocate to a foreign culture. I would look at that and I'd have some real struggles. And I'd say, are you sure, God? Because I'm not really comfortable with that. In fact, that makes me very uncomfortable to think about leaving behind the things that I'm familiar with. I've invested nearly 40 years in learning how to, try to speak the English language a little bit better than I did when I was born, right? I've invested 40 years in that. Invested 40 years in learning the customs of this culture so that I don't look foolish when I do the things I do. Well, I still look foolish sometimes. And maybe you do too. But we're comfortable here because it's familiar. So what if God asked you to leave all this behind and head to a place that was not comfortable? Or what about maybe if God's not calling you that, but He is calling you to expand your circle of friends? Yeah, but I've invested in these friends for the last 15, 20 years. I don't know how long it's been, maybe longer for you. Here are the friends that I know, and we've just got this bond that's so tight, and it's really hard to bring somebody new into that because they don't understand, they don't have the context for all we've been through, and truthfully, I'm not really comfortable going beyond this circle because it's hard for me to meet new people. It's hard for me to bring new people into that group as well. But what if God was calling you to expand your circle of friends? Just something like that. Or what if God was calling you to try to like somebody that you didn't typically like? Yeah, but that person does things that make me feel uncomfortable. What if God was saying to you, listen, I know you don't really like them, but they need to be around somebody like you. They need to see your example of by faith living. And maybe after a while, they'll start to see that there's something different in you, and they'll find out that's what is different in you is Jesus in you, Christ in you, and they'll start to say, I want some of that too, and I need some of that. Not just want, I know I need that in my life. You know, the reality is, as long as you've been following Jesus, at least this is the hope for all of us, that He has been shaping and transforming you so that you look more like Him and less like you the whole time. And so when you encounter someone that you don't like who needs Jesus, the reality is you may not like them because, they need some Jesus in them. And if they got Jesus in them, Jesus would start to change them. And it's not your responsibility to change and transform them. That's what He does. And so maybe God is calling you to engage, to leave your comfort zone and engage with somebody you don't like because they need Jesus too. Or maybe for some of us, God is just calling to leave God is calling us to walk across the street, to leave the comfort of your home and engage with your neighbors. We talked a few years ago about this 9x9 grid that comes out of a book called The Art of Neighboring. And the challenge in that is to get to know your neighbors. Spend some time with your neighbors. Know them by name. Know what you can pray for if they've got things that they need to be prayed over. Engage with them in a way that they know you and know what matters most to you as well. But that's not comfortable. And it's kind of weird to invite your neighbors over for dinner in our society, right? Because we kind of value our privacy. I mean, you know what we do at my house oftentimes? When it's time to eat, that's when all the neighborhood kids have to leave, right? Because dinner time is private time. Houston challenged us several months ago to think about inviting someone in. Would you come eat with me? Inviting someone into your private space, your house. And that's not comfortable. But God isn't calling us to be comfortable always. Or maybe there's a coworker and they're kind of that annoying coworker a little bit to some degree, but you can tell that they've been coming into work lately and something's not quite right. But you don't really want to get involved, right? Because getting involved is not comfortable, and what they're going through could be messy, and if you get involved in that, you could get kind of connected with the mess, and if you get connected with the mess, then your life is going to feel uncomfortable. And so you've got the choice. Do you just stay in your seat at work, or do you walk over, and maybe you don't start with, hey, what's wrong with you? A little bit of tact would be good. Begin a conversation with some lighter things, and then maybe, who knows, maybe you'll find out what is wrong and what's been going on. And oftentimes when things aren't going right in people's lives, that's when they're most receptive to hearing why you're full of joy. Because, again, Jesus lives in you. So again, I'll say for me that my love of things that are comfortable and familiar, when I'm not willing to cross the street, when I'm not willing to engage with someone I don't like, when I'm not willing to leave my chair at work, when I'm unwilling to do what it is that God calls me, whatever it is that God calls me by faith that makes me uncomfortable, those things, whatever it is that is comfortable and familiar for me, can at times be a barrier to living by faith. And here's the deal. God is not asking you. Remember, Abraham was not willing to settle. I mean, he actually looked at the things that made him comfortable and familiar, or that he was comfortable with and that he was familiar with, and said, I'm not willing to settle for that. So God is asking you not to settle for what is comfortable and familiar, because just like he did with Abraham, he has something much better for you. Remember Hebrews 11:6. People who say these kind of things, the verse before, people who say these kind of things, what they show is that they're longing for a better country, a heavenly one. We know that God has something better for us. Therefore, God is not ashamed to be called their God, for he's prepared a city for them. And remember what verse 10 says, just a few verses before that. What kind of city? It's one whose architect and builder is God. So why was Abraham willing to leave behind what he'd been building for 75 years of his life? Because he knew that God built much better things. God builds much better things than what you and I can build. And the reality is that when we live by faith, when we choose to live by faith, what we do in that moment is we declare that we're willing to trade the things that we can build, whether it be relationships, whether it be a comfortable spot in your home, whatever it is that we're able to build, that we have the ability to build, you and I, on our own, when we live by faith, we trade the things that we can build for the things that only God can build. That is what Abraham was willing to do. And that is what his example teaches us. I know by faith living, it's not easy, and it's not going to be easy, because when we live by faith, God is going to call us to leave behind the things that are comfortable and familiar. But if we know in our hearts, more than anything else, as it seemed Abraham must have, that when God calls us to leave behind what's comfortable and familiar, it's because he has something better in front of us, then by faith, we will say yes. We're going to pray together. And I'm going to pray a blessing over us, that God would enable us this week, that God would enable you this week to do one thing, even if it's only one. It's going to be a big step forward for some of us. But to do one thing that you're feeling uncomfortable about, that you believe he may be calling you into. Just one thing. I'm not asking you to do 10 things. Just do one thing that God may be calling you to do, that it is outside of your comfort zone, by faith. And then see if God isn't faithful in building something that only he can build, something much better than you could have ever built if it was up to you. Let's pray. Father, I thank you for these people that are here this morning. I thank you for many of them who are by faith examples for many of us in here already. Father, I pray that we'll be willing to go further, all of us. And this morning I pray that we just go one step further. That God, you would help us this week to see one thing that you're calling us into by faith, that we don't feel comfortable about, that calls us to leave behind what's familiar. But God, because we believe you build better things that we cannot build. Because we believe that by faith about you, that when you call us to leave the familiar, it's because you've got something better. God, I pray that when you make that call this week, that by faith we will say yes. I pray as well that next week we'll have some stories that we share with each other. Maybe the question will be asked, what'd you see by faith? Father, I pray that you will move us by the examples that we see in Hebrews 11 to do similar things. Father, and then one day, Father, may we yearn for that day when we will stand before you and hear the words from you, well done, good and faithful servant. We thank you for Jesus, who's the ultimate by faith example. It's in his name we pray. And the church said, amen.